Continuing on with lecture 15, we're going to talk about some modulators or modifiers of motor signals that are located in the brain. So this is 15b. Those two structures specifically are the basal ganglia and the cerebellum. The basal ganglia are kind of odd in that they are clusters of neurons that are located below the cerebral cortex. So they're often referred to as subcortical. So in the diagram to your left, you can see a representation of the brain, and the blue is showing you the full extent of the basal ganglia. So they're kind of these spirally curved structures. And if you do a coronal slice through the brain, if you look at it, then you can see all these areas in blue together as a group are referred to as the basal ganglia. So the word ganglia is a cluster of neurons that are working together. Usually we've reserved the word ganglia for in the peripheral nervous system, right? Like the dorsal root ganglion has motor neuron, or excuse me, sensory neuron cell bodies in it. These are nuclei or neuron cell body clusters, but they're located in the middle of the brain here. So just to orient you, we can see these are the lateral ventricles, one on each side. Here is the third ventricle in the middle, and then of course this would be the thalamus on either side. So there are different components of the basal ganglia. As you can see, the caudate and putamen together are make up what's called the striatum because it looks like a stripe in the brain. Then we have the globus pallidus because it looks like a pale globe, and then the substantia nigra because it is more darkly colored, and the subthalamic nucleus because it is below the thalamus. For our purposes, I am not going to make you memorize the names of the different parts of the basal ganglia. I just want you to know that they exist. And what I want you to know about them is that they're receiving inputs from all over the place. They're receiving inputs from the cerebral cortex. They're receiving inputs from the thalamus. They're receiving inputs from other parts of the brain and the nervous system. And they are involved in a ton of different feedback loops, some of which are excitatory, some of which are inhibitory. And so they're going to modify and help coordinate movements. They're also involved in habitual behaviors, muscle memory, things that you can do without thinking about it, like tying your shoe. And sometimes if you stop to try to think about it, it messes it up. So what we're seeing here in the diagram to the left is one of several pathways that travels through those different structures of the basal ganglia. Again, I am not going to make you memorize these because conceptually, I don't find it that useful for this level of a course. So that's from the Hedges textbook. This is from the Lim textbook, and they're showing in the kind of the pink bubble here, those are all structures within the basal ganglia, and you can see the cortex is sending them information, the thalamus is sending information, and then they're sending information back out. So what I want you to know about the basal ganglia is there are tons of different feedback loops integrating information from all different parts of the brain, and it's very complicated. The other thing that I want you to know about the basal ganglia is at baseline, tonically, it tends to be inhibitory. This means that when your brain is functioning as normal and is in contact and communication with the rest of your body, most of the time, your central nervous system is actively inhibiting muscle contractions. It's actively inhibiting motor signals. This will be important later when we talk about some disorders, some neuromuscular conditions. So just remember that most of the time it's suppressing movement. So that's the basal ganglia. It's complicated and it's mostly suppressing movement most of the time, except for when we're actually moving, and then it helps us do so in a coordinated way. The other big modifier of motor output is going to be the cerebellum. Now, the cerebellum is kind of mysterious, I think. It turns out it contains 80% of our brain's neurons, despite being far less than 80% of our brain's volumes. It is also one of the most evolutionarily conserved parts of the brain, meaning it's been this way for a really long time. And it has many functions, several of which have to do with motor function, but some of which don't. So we know that it helps integrate sensory information to enable us to have coordinated and effective movement. We know that it also refines motor output for learning tasks. It processes cognitive and executive functions. So somehow it's also in communication with the prefrontal cortex and involved with that, which is really mysterious and exciting. And it also plays a role in learning and attention, also mysterious and exciting. So we're focusing on the somatomotor system for this lecture, so let's dial in on that a little bit. So where is the cerebellum getting its inputs? Where is it getting its information from? Lots of places. One is that the motor cortex that we learned about in the cerebrum is communicating the motor plan to the cerebellum. It's saying, okay, here's the plan. Here's the sequences of muscle contractions that we're planning to do. So it knows what the plan is. Then it also gets a copy of what was actually happening down from the spinal cord. So you send this motor plan down to the spinal cord. We'll get to that later. That's what's going to actually make things happen. And then they're saying, here's what we're doing, right? So that was the plan, and here's what's actually happening on the ground. So that's cool. So the cerebellum can compare those two things. Then it's also getting position sense and proprioception from the body, right? So when we learned about the somatosensory system, we learned about proprioception, those ascending tracks coming up through the spinal cord. So if my plan was to get up from the table and go make myself a cup of coffee, and I said, okay, and I'm going to extend my hips so that I can stand up from the chair, my proprioceptors are now going to be saying, yep, we definitely have extended the hip joint. We are extending the knee joint as well. So I'm getting that real-time feedback from my body. I'm also getting visual information. So, yep, I'm going up in the world, right, as I stand up from the table, and vestibular information. So remember the vestibular system with the semicircular canals, the utricle, the saccule, that's also giving information saying, yep, we're still right side up. We haven't fallen over, right? That's all important to know. And then somatosensory info as well, right? So here's what we feel from a somatosensory standpoint, like, oh, I feel myself putting my foot down on the ground or whatever else it might be. And maybe that's a nice solid floor, or maybe there's a hole there, and that's really important information because now I'm going to need to modify my motor plan. Okay, so lots of inputs, sensory inputs coming from the cerebellum, as well as, little copies of like, this was the plan, this is what's happening on the ground. I think it's fascinating. Okay, now what are the outputs? So the cerebellum is going to take all of this information, it's going to integrate it and process it to figure out what's going on, and then it's going to signal back mostly to the motor cortex so that we can adjust and refine our plan. So let me show you an example of that with a little GIF here. So here's a gymnast, we'll wait for it to restart again, and she's going to lose her balance right there, and whoa, so she just turns it into a handstand and then she's able to stay on the beam. Pretty remarkable. Yes, so this is her cerebellum is saying, uh-oh, we're off balance, making decisions, right? Helping make decisions. Then we're going to modify the motor plan so that we can stay on the beam. Pretty amazing. I'm going to show you another example. All right, this person is trying to do a cartwheel and they are failing, right? So they weren't able to make it work. They weren't able to adjust enough in real time to prevent themselves from falling. Perhaps they haven't practiced quite enough, so they don't have all those pathways already pre-wired. And so the cerebellum also provides balance when standing and walking, but it's also going to send signals back to the prefrontal cortex. So this person might now be saying, gosh, you know what? I really need to extend those triceps. I really need to engage those triceps muscles more to prevent my elbows from buckling, which is the main thing that kind of took him down in this cartwheel attempt. Or maybe his prefrontal cortex is going to decide, you know what? I shouldn't try to do a cartwheel. So one or the other. Or maybe he's going to work out his triceps so he can improve the strength in his arms so that he can do a cartwheel later. We shall see. All right, we don't need to watch him do cartwheels forever, but it's amusing. So, in summary, we have these motor modulators in the brain. The basal ganglia, which are these clusters of nuclei, have lots of feedback loops to help ensure smooth and coordinated action. And tonically, meaning at baseline, when we're not moving, they are actively inhibiting and suppressing muscle contraction, which tells us that if we remove them entirely from the equation, we're going to see a lot more activity of our muscles. The cerebellum, I think, is somewhat mysterious, and certainly it's involved in balance and coordination. It's involved in motor memory and learning, and so it gets input from all of these sensory systems. So visual, vestibular, proprioceptive, somatosensory, and then it also is getting a copy from your motor cortex of what the plan is, as well as communication up from the spinal cord as to what actually happened on the ground. And it's also getting some cognitive inputs as well. The cerebellum, then, the outputs are mostly to the motor cortex, mostly those motor association areas, to modify the plan, to adjust and fine-tune things. All right, so that is it for 15B. Next we'll do pathways.